Yeah, so social media, digital media more broadly, these stimuli activate the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. People who are diagnosed with social media addiction show this same dopamine deficit state as people who have alcohol or heroin or cocaine addiction. So when it comes to digital addictions or technology addictions, it's true. Most people can't just, let their smartphones go, but we have them identify what is the online behavior that I'm engaging in that's causing the harmful consequences that I regret, that's leading to opportunity costs, other things I'm not doing. So Freud talked about the three pillars of a healthy life: work, love, and play. And I think that that's basically correct, except that now we have managed to also drugify work.
Dr. Anna, welcome to the Challenge is Our show. I'm having a bit of a pinch me moment holding your book in my hand while seeing you at the same time. It's amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that warm welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. I want to dive straight in and ask you, why is it so important for us to understand the role dopamine plays in our lives?
Well, dopamine is a critical chemical that we make in our brain. It's essential for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. And of course, it's not the only chemical involved in that process, but it has become a kind of common currency for measuring how reinforcing a substance or behavior is. The more dopamine that we release in our brain's reward pathway and the faster we release it, the more likely that substance or behavior is to be something that our brain tells us you need to do that again. So it's a really critical neurotransmitter. There's been a ton of research in the past 75 years. So it's also a very interesting place to start to understand the relationship between pleasure and pain.
And in your books and like in all your research, you explain so nicely this connection that there is between pleasure and pain, and also all the advance of neuroscience. Can you explain to us what is the connection in our brain between pleasure and pain, and what is the role that dopamine plays in that?
Yeah, so pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain, which means that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And a simplified understanding of how they relate to each other is to imagine that deep in your brain's limbic structures or your emotion brain, you have a balance, like a beam on a central fulcrum, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. And when we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain, it tips the other. Now, this is obviously a vast oversimplification, but it does get to one of the very important concepts in understanding the relationship between pleasure and pain, which is something that's called the opponent process mechanism. So when our brain is at rest, it's that beam is level with the ground, and that's what neuroscientists call homeostasis. Um, One of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it actually wants to preserve homeostasis, such that with any deviation to the side of pleasure or pain, our brains are going to work very hard to restore a level balance. And the way our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. So imagine that we have a drink of alcohol. If we like alcohol, that releases dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. Our balance tilts slightly to the side of pleasure. No sooner has that happened than our brain is going to adapt to that temporary increase in dopamine firing by down-regulating dopamine transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline, a dopamine deficit state before going back up to baseline position. You might imagine that process as these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the hangover, the come down, the blue Monday, or for that matter, just that moment of craving, wanting to have a second drink. Now, if we wait long enough without consuming, the gremlins hop off and a level balance or homeostasis is restored. But if we continue to drink or consume whatever our drug is over days to weeks to months to years, those gremlins on the pain side of the balance start to multiply. They get bigger and stronger. And eventually they're camped out there, tents and barbecues in tow. And now we've entered addicted brain. Now we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to get high, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And importantly, when we're not using, we're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which is anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. So often we will see patients who come in and they're not there for their alcohol use problems or their cannabis problems or their pornography problems or their gambling and online shopping problems. They're there because they're depressed and they're anxious. And they will tell us, but my drug is the only thing that makes me feel undepressed and less anxious. And we tell them, well, it's doing that temporarily, but ultimately all you're doing is adding more gremlins to the pain side of the balance. What you need to do is abstain from your drug of choice for long enough for those gremlins to get the message that they're no longer needed on the pain side of the balance, for them to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. And about 80% of folks who come in with depression, anxiety, etc., who are able to abstain for a month find that they experience significant improvements in those psychiatric symptoms without our having done any other intervention. No pills, no psychotherapy, just simply getting sober restores their ability to experience joy in their lives.
And I love that you just explained this, because very often I think in our culture, and let me know if you agree with that statement, I feel that we use the word addiction, and at a societal level, our mind goes to cocaine or heroin or alcohol. We think about Alcohol Anonymous, we think about AA, we think about rehab, but we don't necessarily think about social media. We don't necessarily think about Netflix or series. We don't necessarily think about tablets or phone or email, but those are really addictive substances as well. Tell us more.
Yeah, so social media, digital media more broadly, these stimuli activate the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. There are preliminary studies coming out showing that people who are diagnosed with social media addiction show this same dopamine deficit state as people who have alcohol or heroin or cocaine addiction. So we can see the same kind of pathophysiology occurring in response to addiction to these digital media. I should probably emphasize that although addiction is clearly a brain disease, we're not yet at the state of the art where we can use brain scans or blood tests, for that matter, to diagnose addiction. We still base the diagnosis on phenomenology, which is to say patterns of behavior that are very identifiable, repeat themselves across cultures, time periods, demographics. And that is to say the 3 C's: out of control use, compulsive use, and continued use despite consequences, and tolerance, needing more of our drug to get the same effect, and withdrawal, experiencing predictable negative symptomatology when we cut back or stop using. So that's the definition of addiction. And yes, people can get seriously addicted to different forms of digital media. We don't usually see serious email addiction, although email can be its own minor addiction, but we do see quite serious addictions to things like TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, online pornography, online shopping, online gambling, online gaming, or just kind of diffusely the internet, and kind of the mindless scrolling, surfacing one platform or another, not being able to get off, finding that there are enormous opportunity costs, which is an important thing, an important consequence of addiction. That is to say, other things that we're not doing because we're spending all of our time on this particular medium. People losing their jobs, losing their key relationships, people needing more and more potent forms. So they're then engaging in illegal activity online. So we are seeing all of this. Now, the vast majority of people, the vast majority of us now is online, and most of us can self-regulate, and self-correct. But I can tell you that there's a subset of individuals who really get caught in a way that is just absolutely devastating, and who find it very difficult to recapture their own agency, and to modify those behaviors, especially given continued access.
And if we have somebody listening right now who is thinking, I'm really wondering whether my use of the substance of choice is recreational, in other words, relatively adaptive, so use on an ad hoc basis in a recreational measure, or addictive, meaning maladaptive and compulsive, how would one gauge where they're at, whether they're still in the adaptive recreational or maladaptive addictive?
It can be very difficult to know. I mean, on the extreme end of addiction, I think everybody can recognize it, including the addicted person. But addiction is a spectrum disorder, mild, moderate, severe. And on the milder end, it can be kind of hard to tell, often because we ourselves will tend to minimize the harms and maximize the benefits of our behaviors in our own minds, whereas other people may be able to have a more objective view of it. So that's one reason it's very actually difficult to observe true cause and effect in ourselves while we're engaging in the activity. But I mean, one of the things to do is to look at the three C's. Do I have out of control use? Is my use compulsive? Meaning, am I initiating in an automatic kind of habitual way without planning to, or even contrary to my desire to stop? And then, of course, consequences. And those consequences can take many different forms. I talked about mood, anxiety, irritability consequences. There are also relationship consequences, work consequences. There are moral and spiritual consequences. People will often go outside of their moral compass when they're engaging in their addictive behavior. One thing that's not included in the diagnostic criteria but can be a soft sign is what we call the lying habit. Often people will have this double life where they have a secret life where they use, and then their other public life that where they hide their use. And the lying about the use can often become generalized to where people with addiction are now lying about what they had for breakfast, even though it's not really related to their use, which is why one of the things that we prescribe is actually radical honesty, where we encourage people to tell the truth about every little thing as a way to help them get into recovery. But, because it's often, even with all of those things in mind, hard to know if we have a problem, one of the ways to test it is to do a dopamine fast, or to try to stop our drug of choice for 4 weeks, and see, number one, can we do it? Number two, how hard is it? And number three, how do we feel afterwards? Because sometimes people realize, oh, I thought I could control this behavior. It turns out I can't stop on my own. I need help.
Mm.
Or number two, I was able to stop, but wow, it was a lot harder than I thought it would be, which is a pretty good signal that we've developed that, neuroadaptation with those gremlins camped out on the pain side of the balance. And then number three, even if it wasn't all that hard, people might get to the end of that 30-day dopamine fast and feel better in a lot of ways that they wouldn't have predicted, such that they might be motivated to maintain abstinence or go back to using, but use differently, use less. You have a different kind of relationship with the substance or behavior.
And that's really the topic I wanted to touch upon, because when I'm thinking dopamine fast, I can think of the idea of going so-called cold turkey, right? So we work a lot with clinical hypnotherapy with folks that use alcohol to numb and soothe anxiety, or drugs. And of course, the cold turkey methodology is to just eliminate that drug or the alcohol. However, I'm thinking here about substances that are harder to go cold turkey with. If we're thinking about somebody who's addicted to food, for example, or to sugar, or addicted to their phone usage, they can't socially go cold turkey and stop eating totally or stop having a phone. So how does the dopamine fast work in that period when the substance of choice is a substance that they still need in moderation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In order to tackle these types of addictions, we have borrowed from Gamblers Anonymous. They have this kind of like a bullseye, where the center of the bullseye is the addictive behavior. However, that's defined. So with various type of food addictions, usually it's things like sugar, carbohydrates, junk food, snack food, that would kind of go into that. And then the middle ring is triggers for the addictive behavior. So not necessarily something that, I'm addicted to, but something that might trigger my desire to engage in my addictive behavior. So again, for food, it might be watching YouTube videos of people eating, of which there are many, would be maybe something to avoid. And then in that outer circle is healthy adaptive behaviors, things I should do instead of. Using my drug of choice, that would be things like healthy and moderate exercise, or going out in nature, or going and talking to another person, or maybe attending a Food Addicts Anonymous meeting. So that kind of thing. When it comes to digital addictions or technology addictions, it's true. Most people can't just, let their smartphones go. They need them for work, they need them for basic communication, but we have them identify what is the online behavior that I'm engaging in that's causing the harmful consequences that I regret, that's leading to opportunity costs, other things I'm not doing. Typically, people can identify, a category of behavior like, being on TikTok, YouTube, other forms of social media. We would then ask them to delete those apps and not go on social media for a month. If it's in the category of pornography and compulsive masturbation, we would say do not watch any pornography for a month, but also no masturbation, no orgasms with yourself or others, because in sex addiction and pornography addiction, the pornography is one part, and the orgasm is the other part. So we ask them to abstain from orgasm for a month, even including with their intimate partner. So no orgasms for a month to kind of reset reward pathways. For gambling addiction, it might be deleting all the sports betting apps, not going to casinos. You can actually call casinos and put yourself on a no admit list so that they won't let you in if you go there. So all these kinds of self-binding strategies where we try to limit our access or limit easy access to our drug of choice, whatever it is, set a date for going cold turkey or for fasting, fast from that substance or behavior for 30 days. Importantly, knowing that we will feel worse before we feel better, and that's the pain of withdrawal. Again, those universal symptoms are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. If you think back to that pleasure-pain balance, if you've got all these gremlins accumulated on the pain side and you take away your drug on the pleasure side, of course, the first thing that's going to do is you're going to crash down to the side of pain. Craving will be intense. What's so amazing about this state, though, of early withdrawal is it feels like it will last forever. It feels like the craving will never go away and that we'll never feel better, but it really is time limited. Those first 10 to 14 days can be hell, but if we can get through that by week 3, week 4, really the sun starts to come out. Craving starts to dissipate. We're not then constantly thinking about using. We're able to enjoy other more modest rewards that maybe we haven't enjoyed for a very long time.
And I would love your take on how you handle relapses with your patient, because I'm sure you've seen that in your patients where somebody has tried or attempted to stop smoking weed or use cocaine, and they perhaps succeeded for 1 month and they felt great. And then one day they had this really crazy meeting, or they got fired, or their wife filed for divorce, and it feels like, forgive my French, a shitstorm in their life. And they go and they call the dealer and they smoke that weed, or they get access. And they actually say it's not so much because of the drug, but it's because of the circumstances or what happened in my life. And then they relapse. And then that breaks their confidence. And then they call you and go, Dr. Anna, here is the proof. Here it is. I'm failing. I can't do it. I'm using again. And every time something happens in my life, that's my crutch. How do you guide those folks who perhaps have lost their own faith or confidence because they keep on relapsing every time something really intense happens in their life?
Yeah, well, I mean, my first reaction to a relapse is really just compassion. I just always respond with like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened." Very non-judgmental. And I really think that the disease model frame of reference is very helpful here, understanding that this is a deeply physiologic phenomenon where our reward centers are hijacked by the disease. Neural circuits are changed through the process of addiction. And even though we have the capacity for recovery, we also always preserve the latent capacity for relapse because those neural networks might burn down to slight embers, but they probably never really burn out, especially in more severe cases where people are very prone to addiction. So I always normalize it. If the relapse was in the context of stress, I also validate that. I say, we know from animal experiments, if you train a rat to press a lever, to give free access to a lever press for cocaine, it will press that lever till exhaustion or death. If you then take the cocaine away before they've reached that end point, they'll stop pressing the lever because there's no more cocaine. But if then you expose the rat to a very painful foot shock, the first thing the rat will do is run back over and resume pressing the lever. So it's very natural that in the case of extreme stressors, our primitive lizard brain would remember, oh, there's that way that I could get dopamine, which I need right now to counteract this very stressful, painful circumstance. That's just simply how we're wired. So then it's a matter of then talking through, okay, something very stressful happened. You reached for this thing that you knew would give you temporary comfort, or be a temporary solution for your brain disease, but obviously not really a solution. So let's think of what are some other coping strategies or more adaptive strategies for the next time that you get under stress, and let's write them down. Right. And let's put them right on your screen, or put them on a piece of paper and fold them in your wallet. And those are things like, again, reaching out to a human being, going to a 12-step meeting, if that's your thing, getting on your knees and praying, if that's your thing, immersing yourself in an ice cold water plunge, anything to kind of like shake up those kind of deeply ingrained, default networks that we're vulnerable to when we experience stress.
Now, one of the reasons why I really wanted to get your view on addictive behavior and the role of dopamine is also because of my line of work. I work as a professional burnout advisor and clinical hypnotherapist, and the type of clients that I serve are most often addicted to work. And I honestly refer to myself as a recovered workaholic. My substance of choice has always been work. I haven't struggled in my professional life with, drinking or drugs, but I have really, really struggled with compulsive behavior towards work. So hiding the fact that I was working, lying about working, working in secrecy, treating work almost like a person with whom I had this secret relationship. And I'm talking about work here, of finding this high. I remember the feeling of getting a high from work well done, and also liking things that you're not supposed to like. So, all-nighters, staying all night in the office. I got a kick out of it. I just got something that made me feel, if I'm busy, if I'm exhausted, it's just good. And I actually learned to stay up. I resisted the urge to sleep, so much so that I actually ended up with a diagnosis of clinical insomnia, because I learned maladaptively to resist the urge to sleep so much that one day I couldn't even fall asleep if I tried. So I when I tell my story about being a former attorney, people expect that I'm going to say, oh, I hated it. It was tough. I quit. No. I was obsessed. I was addicted. I loved it too much. That's how I burnt out. What's your take on that? Can work, in your psychiatric opinion, be an addiction?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So Freud talked about the three pillars of a healthy life: work, love, and play. And I think that that's basically correct, except that now we have managed to also drugify work. And what do I mean by that? We've made it more potent, we've made it more accessible, we've made it more bountiful, and we've made it more novel. It's more potent because now we have all these ways of kind of like recognizing people who work harder. Workaholics are heroes in modern day society. The workaholic billionaire is like every young person strives to be that. So you've got this like social norms and social accolades that go along with that drugifies work. Quantity and access, we now can do work anywhere, anytime. There's no natural stopping point. And when it comes to addiction and changing our brains, quantity and frequency really do matter. Anything that we're using daily, we're more vulnerable to get addicted to it. And again, if we're never stopping and never giving our brain, time to recover, we're also more vulnerable to addiction. And then you've got, novelty, all the ways in which, we in this fast-paced world, I mean, their work can be very interesting and feel very important and very vital, and like we're in the center of things. I mean, I'm sitting here in the heart of Silicon Valley, and that feeling pervades everything, along with FOMO, the fear of missing out. Well, if I'm
Yes.
not working, then is my life even worth anything? Am I allowed to breathe the air? Who cares if I live and die? All these kinds of existential questions come up. So, although I believe that meaningful work is a part of a meaningful life, and that we're really wired to strive and not meant to just sit around and do nothing or be lazy, I do think that you're absolutely right that because we've drugified work, made it more potent, accessible, bountiful, and novel, we're all at risk to fall into this kind of maladaptive, trance-like state where all we know how to do is work. We have no hobbies or interests outside. And then most importantly, we're not cultivating our primary relationships and putting the time that we need to put into them, especially like spending time with our children and our partner. You can't get those years back. Like if you're not there for quantity time, it's not just quality time. It's that if you're not there for the boring parts, when you're raising your kids as well as the exciting parts, then you're not there. And it's really hard to navigate the complexity of an enduring relationship through time unless you're putting in the time.
And it leads to co-addiction as well, because at
That's
least
right.
speaking about my personal experience, my primary addiction was work, but I have to admit that that addiction led to many other maladaptive usage, right?
Mm.
So I wouldn't say that I was necessarily addicted to other substances, but I did maladaptively overuse or excessively rely on many things
Mm-hmm.
to cover up for my primary addiction, which was work. And I see that now with my clients quite a lot.
Mm.
One addiction, which is, I would call the primary addiction, leads to many other related sub addictions, so to speak, because you need to have that to cope with the primary addiction. Can you see that as well with your
Can you
work?
give some examples?
Yes, of course. So typically my clients would say, the classic example would be, I've had a terrible day at work. I've worked all hours under the sun. Every hour has been called for. I haven't had a minute. So I'm going to now indulge in what I call revenge procrastination. So I get home, it's 1 a.m. I know rationally and intellectually the right thing to do is to go to bed because tomorrow I have another rough day. But instead, I'm going to have 3 glasses of wine or 2
Mm.
whiskeys, watch a series until
Right.
3 a.m.,
Right.
smoke, vape, do all
Right.
those things. So my revenge procrastination, and the more stressed I am, the more I vape, the more I eat, have my ice cream, have my things, whatever those things might be. So then the next day I feel worse. So then I have even more caffeine or something else. What I see is the more addicted a person is, the more they tend to need to rely on sedatives and stimulants. So they need something to put them down and they need something to level them up.
Yeah. Right.
And that is the vicious circle. Can you
Yeah.
explain that from a dopamine
Yeah.
standpoint?
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, that's what I call the work hard, play hard problem. In healthy work, we would let that work be its own reward. Remember, we're pressing on the pain side of the balance. The gremlins go over to the pleasure side of the balance. We get our dopamine indirectly through effortful engagement, and that's its own reward. But that stops working if instead of letting, you know, first of all, listening to the limits of our own bodies and our own brains and what we can reasonably accomplish in a day and letting ourselves rest and recover from work, we instead press hard on the pain side of the balance, work, and then we don't let that there be a natural homeostatic mechanism. At the end of that long day of too much work, we then press hard on the pleasure side of the balance with very often intoxicants, like you mentioned, alcohol, sedatives, Netflix, food, what have you, kind of narcotizing ourselves only to do it all over again. And importantly, any time, I mean, the biological definition of stress is any deviation from homeostasis. So every time we press hard on the pleasure side of the balance or the pain side of the balance, we're actually triggering our own endogenous stress hormones, our own adrenaline, our own cortisol. And it's work to restore homeostasis. So when we're working more than we should, getting into sleep deprivation, we're pressing way too hard on the pain side. That releases cortisol. And then we're pressing hard on the pleasure side as a way to reward ourselves for all that work. And now we've got even more stressor. And then we're using to sort of compensate for the stress of using. So it gets to be a very vicious cycle.
So how could one who perhaps identify with this, somebody who's working really, really hard in a very demanding profession, doesn't have that much control over how much they work, but listening to this and recognizing themselves, yes, I do all those maladaptive things to sedate myself in the evening and all those maladaptive things to stimulate myself in the morning. I've also had clients who take Adderall, for example, even though they don't need it medically, but they take it like a stimulant, right? And this is seen more and more in the legal profession, but also in investment banking and trading and all kinds of white collar profession where there is misuse of medical grade pills to actually work, right? So that it's used. What could somebody do to perhaps reset their dopamine while working so hard so that they could have more adaptive way of spending their evening and their mornings?
Well, it depends on the severity of the addiction as well as this work circumstance. With someone with a very severe addiction, snorting cocaine every morning, drinking alcohol and using sedatives every night, doing that daily, basically what I say to people is it is a fantasy to think that you can get into recovery and continue your work arrangement as it currently is. That is not possible. You will have to, in order to take care of yourself and treat your addiction, you will have to take a step back from your work. You will have to live differently. And of course, people don't want to hear that. They want to just keep going. But the body can't really survive and be healthy at those extreme limits. So they really have to change their lives. And they have to work less. They have to have more balance. To really get into recovery, that's also a job in and of itself, right? Especially the early stages of recovery are extremely painful and difficult. So I think that's the first thing I would say. With somebody who's got a milder form of addictions, they might be able to keep up that same intensity, although I kind of doubt it. But they could try just to abstain, without from their drug of choice. And still maintain a certain level of work. Maybe they would even do better work because they would be more clear-headed, more rested. I mean, that's a possibility. But that would be folks who are sort of on the milder form of, the addiction spectrum. I will say, though, that mixed into all of this is identity issues, that people who are successful at work, it becomes a very important part of who they are in the world and how people think of them. And they may have created a whole social entourage that kind of now relies on them to either earn a certain amount of money or to be that guy. But even if there aren't other people pressuring them, they're sort of pressuring themselves. There's a lot of existential angst around, like, who am I if I'm not this person who does this thing? And that's I think for that, people really kind of need some deep spiritual work or some serious psychotherapy to get in touch with the part of themselves that's not defined by these external, materialistic measures, to really get in touch with like life and death and what it's all really about, and what they want to be able to say about how they live their lives, when they're about to die. And whether looking back, I worked an 80-hour work week for 30 years. Okay, is that, are you going to feel good about that? And maybe the answer is yes for some people. Maybe it really is. But if it's not, then they should change their lives.
I had to remove the substance of choice. I
Yeah,
locked myself into an Indian ashram
there
for
you
three
go.
months.
What was there a critical moment where you were like, "Oh my gosh, this is crazy. I need to get out of here."
Oh, well, the critical moment was my mother calling me, telling me that my father had a burnout induced heart attack on his way to work. So
Oh,
I was
wow.
just looking into my future because I was, you know,
Yeah.
becoming him.
Yeah, and
So,
often it is a kind of life and death moment where
oh,
death in
absolutely.
particular, disease and death intrudes, and we kind of suddenly get a different
The
perspective.
three Ds, I call them in my line of work. You get a divorce, you get death, or you get depression
Disease. Oh,
or
depression.
disease
Yeah, right.
diagnosis,
Yeah.
right? One of those Ds usually kind of
Right. Yeah.
shakes you to the core. And
Yeah.
at this point, I didn't know how to do it in moderation. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to go out to an Indian ashram,
Right, right. People are
but
different. Yeah.
I really needed something to
Yeah.
extract me from that drug of
Yes.
choice and to
Right.
remove me and to reset. And for me, the most healing way to reset my dopamine was to learn to breathe, to meditate, to move. And
Mhm.
then I was able to go back into a very high paced corporate life, but with moderation. And
Nice.
I learned not to trust myself. So a bit like
Ah.
a former alcoholic
Yeah.
will learn, I also have to buffer myself from work
Yeah.
temptation. So I still treat work like a source of addiction.
Okay, good. So you have a lot of like self-binding strategies where
Loads,
you
loads.
have
That's why when I was
certain,
reading your
yeah,
book, I was
yeah,
like, tick, tick, tick.
yeah, right, right.
So, for example, for my sleep, my self-binding strategy is to actually block my calendar so that no one, no client, not my PA, not
Right.
my team can book me. And I put blocks and it says sleep. That
Nice.
way I
Yeah.
know I'm sleeping,
Yeah.
because if I don't do that, I'll just go ahead and book another
Right.
meeting.
Like a bedtime alarm, but you've actually
Yes, like a
blocked it.
child. I need to
Like,
treat
yeah,
myself like a
yeah,
baby.
yeah. Well, I mean, we all needed to, I think that's great. Actually, I block on my calendar. My kids laugh at me. It's TTT, time to think. I actually have to block it off
Love
my calendar
that.
because otherwise I'll be liable to just spend all day in meetings, calling pharmacies, meeting with students, all things that I'm happy to do, but I need a break.
How do you maintain your dopamine at an optimal level? Because I know how busy you are and how
Yeah.
much you serve people around the world. How do you do what you do without tipping the balance off? And I know you've also had your own battles with
Yeah.
different kind of romantic vampire based
Right.
addiction, and for
Right.
that reason I really liked you. Actually, because I have a bit of a fascination with the vampire and
Yeah,
twilight thing.
yes, right. Oh no. Reading has always been my big escape, but it really wasn't until, the technology allowed for the e-reader that I ran into trouble and I found that I guess I got slightly addicted to romance novels. I was reading them every night, late into the night. I also unlearned how to put myself to sleep without reading romance novels. I got to a point I was taking them to work and reading in the 10 minutes between patients, getting more and more anxious and down and not enjoying things the way I used to. And it was all because my reward pathway was hijacked by these romance. I just wanted to be in fantasy. So I did what I prescribed to my patients. I went cold turkey for a month and was really shocked at how difficult it was. I had so much restless anxiety in the evenings and the times that I would normally read to calm myself down and to reward myself. But after about 3 or 4 weeks, I felt a lot better. So then I thought, well, I'll just go back to reading in moderation. And then that weekend I binged and went to work bleary eyed again. I was like, oh, I guess this moderation thing is not going to work. And then I decided to give up novels, actually, all novels for a year. And I had never gone that long without reading a novel, but it was really good for me. It really kind of reset my brain. And, what do I do to sort of try to stay healthy? I mean, I still can get where I'm like caught up in some fantasy novel and stay up later than I like, but not so much the way that I used to. I've kind of burned out my neurons for romance. I was like, I don't even enjoy them anymore. But that's sort of sad, right? I hear that from my patients too. Like their drug of choice that sort of worked for them for years, like now it totally doesn't work. Like they've neuroadapted so profoundly to that drug, it does nothing for them. And that's how romance novels are like. There's no romance novel that's interesting or rewarding for me now. other types of reading I can do. But the big ones for me to kind of maintain balance, I get up before the sun rises and I walk or I swim. And I usually do that with my husband, but even if we don't do it together, I do it by myself. I would say I do that 6 or 7 days a week. I'm older now. I have musculoskeletal issues, so I'm not like out there training for some, it's modest exercise, but it's a kind of a meditative practice that just totally transforms my mood for the day. And then the other thing that I do that's so important is I make sure I don't work too hard, because exactly the same thing. If I'm at work and luckily I'm in a profession and at a stage in my profession where I have control over I can titrate my work. But if I have a day I see too many patients, I go too long, same thing. I go home and all I want to do is watch YouTube videos, and I start watching them. I have no willpower. I mean, 2 hours, 3 hours later, I'm watching the most ridiculous, total waste of time. So, yeah, just really trying to take care of myself by recognizing that my brain and body can only do so much, and I need to rest, and I need to really respect, my natural limits.
Thank you, Dr. Anna. I think that's really the most beautiful word to close this with. When we respect our natural limits, we don't go into this dopamine gremlins overdrive,
That's
right?
right.
That's
That's right.
right.
Beware of the gremlins.
Dr. Anna, was there anything you wanted to cover that we haven't covered yet as a final word?
No, this was great. Thanks for sharing your experience. It was very interesting for me to hear, your perspective and what happened to you.
I appreciate that, and I wish you many beautiful sunrise and walks with your husband and beloved family.